Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the first webinar in the Living Dialogs series. My name is Rob Gorbett, and I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo and a researcher with the Living Architecture Systems Group. I'm also a co-producer of the Living Dialogs series. This first episode of the series is about the principles, aesthetics, and sustainability of living architecture, and started with the release of the Episode 1 podcast on March 15th. You can find that podcast online on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and at www.lasg.ca/living. This webinar will continue that discussion in a different format, allowing our guests to go deeper into the topic and respond to some of the thoughts podcast listeners provided on the Living Dialogs website, and to questions that you provided when you registered for the webinar. We will also have a live Q&A session at the end. Before we get started, a few housekeeping rules. We're recording today's session and it will be available online following the webinar. You'll receive a link to that at your registration email, which we invite you to share widely. To keep the recording as clean as possible, please keep microphones and video off unless the moderator calls on you during the Q&A for clarification of your question. We will use the chat to collect questions for the Q&A session. So if you have a question for the panel, feel free to put it into the chat whenever you like, but preface it with the word question in all caps if possible, so that our webinar team can curate those for the later Q&A. If your question is for a specific guest, please indicate that in the question. At this point, I'll turn it over to Sarah Bonmaison, our moderator, to introduce herself and our guests. Thank you.
My name is Sarah Bonmaison, and I'm a professor of architecture at Dalhousie University in Halifax. I have a profound interest in organicism and have been leading the theory stream of the LASG since we began.
My name is Jenny Sabin, and I am the Weisenberger Professor of Architecture at Cornell University. And I'm also the Associate Dean for Design Initiatives for the college. I direct a lab where I engage in transdisciplinary collaborations with colleagues in the sciences and engineering to innovate new material strategies and fabrication protocols, and also to address the question, how might buildings and their related material systems behave more like organisms, responding to their adaptive contexts. And then lastly, I am also principal of Jenny Sabin Studio, a practice based in Ithaca, where we're able to take fundamental research into application and engage the built environment.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Mitchell Joachim. I'm an architect and urban designer in Brooklyn, New York. I'm the co-founder of Terreform ONE, a 501c3 nonprofit, essentially think tank here in the new lab. And I'm an associate professor of practice at New York University.
I'm Philip Beesley. I'm a professor of architecture at the University of Waterloo School of Architecture and a past rather long practitioner involved in public architecture, working with public firms. I lead the Living Architecture Systems Group, working with multiple extraordinary collaborators on the common devotion now to the idea that architecture can be very effectively understood as something that is alive. And in parallel with those works, I have a private practice studio, Philip Beesley Studio Incorporated, which is in the past practiced architecture and now is focused on public installations.
Thank you, Philip. So with the same order, if Jenny, if you would like to share your screen and some images that you've collected.
Thank you, Sarah. The research and design work of my practice embodies an experimental design studio where we interrogate spaces between disciplines and explore intersections of architecture and science and apply insights and theories from biology and mathematics and beyond to the design, fabrication, and production of material structures and human-centered spatial interventions. With strong links to my lab here at Cornell AAP, the driving mission behind both my practice and research is to create resilient, science-driven, and transformative spaces with and for diverse communities. We frequently start with very simple parts and rules that, through feedback and iteration produce much more complex spatial wholes. This interest probes the productive tinkering and misuse of fabrication machines frequently found in alternate industries, such as in textiles and the automotive industry. This is Sola, a 6-axis industrial robot within my lab. And importantly, these systems and methods and thinking are also informed by issues of craft and making to produce bio-inspired material systems and software design tools that have the capacity to facilitate embedded expressions in our built environments. This is also filtered through material organizations to produce models that are at once natural as well as artificial. And we purposefully resist the post-rationalization of complex form through an approach that engages a materially directed generative design process, or what I call matter design computation. And this also importantly has impact in both science, architecture, and engineering in terms of applications and fundamental research. As mentioned, we ask, how might buildings behave more like organisms, responding to and adapting to their built environments? Drawing on historian Detlef Mertens' description of his term Bioconstructivisms, the emphasis is upon the analogic negotiation of morphological behavior as a dynamic substrate that is then filtered through material organizations. That is, the pursuit is to form a biosynthesis of a natural model with its material manifestation. The architectural results of such an experiment, to use Mertens' words, are, quote, self-different, in which identity is hybrid, multiple, and open-ended. Biosynthetic architecture, importantly, is not just a metaphor. It is an analog of deeper connections, a trans-individual and transdisciplinary architecture that is steered by the systemic and relational conditions of life, from cell to sentiment, as an undulating network of parts and their informed wholes, a datascape of human embeddedness. So that's a brief overview of some of the key concepts and work that we engage in. Here are a few members of my amazing teams, both in the lab as well as my practice. And you can find us here to take a deeper look into the work of both Jenny Sabin Studio and the Sabin Lab at Cornell AAP. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. We had thought it was important to have each panelist show something because the podcast was, just oral. So that's why we're doing this. And it was very helpful. Thank you so much, Jenny. Mitchell, do you want to share something?
The work that we're doing at Terreform ONE is a lot of research and design on different ideations of nature. It's nature before humans, nature during humans, and nature after humans. And then, I think there's a fourth and fifth version of nature where it has nothing to do with even the planet Earth. So it's extraterritorial versions of nature. One of the biggest problems that we're tackling is this wildlife issue, decreasing at an alarming rate. Less than, I guess more than 50% now has gone since the 70s. And that is a difficult kind of statistic to deal with. That's every kind of bird, fish, mammal, insect on this planet seems to be dying off. And that becomes an issue when we think about how we approach our cities and how we think about the designs that we produce. So here we look at the near future possibilities of our cities. This is 42nd Street, where we think about replacing what we have today with a walkable city, a city that becomes a grand civic space, introducing something like a riparian corridor through the center of this system, vertical access wind turbines and photovoltaics that skin buildings, facades that are productive green spaces that are there for air quality and food production, as well as trackless trains, and as much as possible, some sort of automation to take care of some of these things, and leaving it left over for being a walkable place, a place of pleasured motion and encounters. Another kind of version of what we do in cities is trying to save animals from going extinct. In this case, it's the monarch butterfly. We've lost 90 million of these creatures in the last few years. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services is putting them at a near endangered status. They're native to New York City, so we've designed systems inside buildings that think about the life cycle of monarchs themselves, everything from their caterpillar stage and egg laying stage to the amount of milkweed they consume to adult stage, and then eventually rewilding the city around them. Produce these modules. They're essentially what we call Biotope Mosaics, which are meant to attach to existing buildings and give a life form, in this case, a sanctuary, so that they can start to re-engage the city and increase their populations. At the same time, increase biodiversity. That is one of our major goals, is to get more of the stuff of life happening inside urban areas. This particular building does that by considering the different feeding mechanisms, the local ecosystem around it, different materials inside the building. Certainly on the rooftop, there's an education center and a pollinator garden. Spaces through the atrium continue with these kinds of feeders. Here we're looking specifically at the feeder itself for the American Museum of Natural History, designing different platforms for the proboscis and the butterfly to eat, and different areas for respite and for just basically enjoying fruit and different nectars, which is what they do. We work at full scale with live organisms in almost all of our projects, and team up with companies such as BASF and Intel to make advanced forms of concrete that are as green as possible and get down to zero emissions, if not create a positive contribution to the field. So not only would it do no harm, but something that will actually do good, such as sucking away pollution. Here, this is the Green Sense concrete that gets embedded into the facade of this building. It is structural. It will last 200 years. It's fireproof. It has areas for the butterflies to rest, to drink, to enjoy mud baths, to basically get a chance to survive on this planet. Actually do more than survive, thrive. When you look out the window of this building, you get to see an entire vertical garden that's essentially increasing the biodiversity, celebrating the life of these butterflies, which can move in and out of the system. It's permeable, and you can enjoy your space on the inside. Here it is in the triennial at the Smithsonian, Cooper Hewitt. Different types of bioplastics there, part of the nectar feeding mechanisms, and these are the butterflies enjoying life in this system. And then, a couple of other more recent projects here, taking that same system with a more practical minded developer in Los Angeles and reskinning this honestly developer driven skyscraper that's going up no matter what anyone else says. So it's roughly a 70-story tower. And here thinking about two areas where we can increase biodiversity on the skin of that building. So a central component, and as well as the terminus, that will deal with a very similar system, a facade designed for the El Segundo and another butterfly locally that's in that system, as well as the parking garage below. Here is similar concrete system and double skin facade with a filtration and an irrigation mechanism that keeps these plants, which are drought resistant, watered, thriving, and alive. These are the different types of plants we're using, from oregano to lavender to creeping vines, etc. All of that intended to keep butterflies and different insects thriving within this project. I think it's great that a developer can find the time and the energy and at a modicum of cost, consider the biodiversity around something like Los Angeles, which, believe it or not, there is nature there, and start creating projects like this, which send a grand semiotic pulse about how we can reintroduce ideas of nature and biodiversity in our buildings. Here is the entryway to that system, where you can see the different monarchs, in this case, thriving, and a central panel there is for education about their disappearance and what we can do to keep them alive. A section here shows some of the watering and maintenance issues that are actually a big part of our plans. It's not just put butterflies in the building, but it's to think about this building operating for 50 years with different live organisms inside it. And I guess I want to stop there before I get into the Navy Yard work, because we're going to have a lot of time to talk about our project.
I just have to tell you that now Paris is selling a lot of honey from bees that are in the Parisian trees.
Excellent.
I can give you the website of where to buy it.
Excellent.
Okay, Philip.
I'm pretty moved to see the projects of my colleagues Jenny and Mitchell with their different approaches. What I want to share is just a couple of physical models to share a meditation on how architecture might contribute to living systems. When I hold up this lovely little orb, I think that I'm embodying a very specific kind of architecture, the architecture that I've been taught, perhaps, the architecture in which a transcendently pure surrounding, perhaps the origin of the world, holds a lovely paradise inside. There, you can see a little crystal garden. In that, it's a wet weather dome. And this kind of tradition of the paradise garden and the bounded city is so fundamental to the Western idea of architecture. It does produce something extraordinarily precious inside those tough, absolute walls. And there's so many versions of this. Here's Libeskind's crystal, for example, with this absolute kind of edge, the transcendental edge where the boundary is, and then the gentleness of the inspiration and consciousness inside. And yet, if that's boiled down into its essence, the idea of an optimum, and we look at the absolute sphere, the kind of geometric machine which has the maximum possible territory inside and the minimum possible boundary, because that's what the physics of this kind of geometry is, then I think that we can see that this is also fearsomely powerful, even capable of imparting tremendous harm. I mean, it's the most perfect kind of shape for ballistics, for example, or for pressure from the deep. And it's somehow something that resists the outside and gathers and maximizes its territory inside, even as if it is so beautiful. So what are these models for architecture? Somehow I want to contrast this kind of human invention to this one, in which the same kind of agenda, that is, of creating a sanctuary and holding something inside, is achieved with a fluxing and a kind of extraordinary kind of response that allows continuous tempered adjustments. And I love this one too. Sorry, I'm just bringing these on screen as I speak, by our colleagues in CETA, the Center for Information Technology and Architecture, in which the Flora Robota project demonstrates a kind of scaffolding that is so utterly resistant and tough and compliant, and yet somehow yielding at the same time. A couple of our own contributions in the Living Architecture Systems group alongside that are perhaps these very, very compliant, gentle, snowflake-like elements, which certainly produce nest-like sanctuaries, but at the same time allow an open threshold to work. Here's a more developed version of that, in which you can see little grottos and seeds containing the same kind of crystalline boundaries of the original sanctuaries, while having a kind of a festival of exchange, trying to be as unapologetically vulnerable as possible. My favorite version of this is this unapologetically vulnerable, fragile wasp's nest, where each layer simply will evaporate and boil off and will be renewed by the next, but making the toughest kind of sanctuary. And so perhaps I've overstated it when I say that this is an unfortunate kind of model of architecture. The combination of all of these qualities, moving back and forth between wall making and a radical openness and a fertility, perhaps are the combinations that make for living systems. So I do want to propose that some new paradigms could replace an old classical idea in which that transcendental walled boundary is the basis of architecture. Perhaps the familiar triad by Vitruvius, the Roman writer who defined architecture 2,000 years ago as being made of the firmitas, the permanence of the world, the kind of stable skin, and then the kind of information, the kind of beautiful function of how something would be used, and the beauty of it, that is that triad of permanence and use and beauty, might be replaced by three new terms, which are the minimum ingredients for life itself. That is to say, scaffolding and information and metabolism. And perhaps there's a lovely resonance between those two things, that is, where the firmity of the world is replaced by an open scaffold, where the kind of functional use and programming of our things is replaced by constantly renewing information, a kind of lovely persistent model of understanding and sentience, and perhaps whether a code and an aura of beauty is replaced by the vivid kind of festival of a metabolism and continual exchange. So I hope those kind of paradigms might be a contribution along with those form models.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Philip. So one of our guests has asked us a difficult question to define living architecture in one sentence. So I thought I'll try that way. It makes it fair. So to whoever asked the question, for me, I'm engaged in living architecture because I think it's important to be learning from nature, to create an architecture that rhetorically engages our relationship to nature. And rhetorically is a key word for me here. Does somebody else wants to try?
The question was define living architecture in one sentence.
Yes.
Okay. Am I being graded on this? I can.
No. Of course not.
I would say living architecture makes no distinction between the flora and fauna that surrounds it.
Nice.
It is at one.
Together.
Together.
Yeah. Wonderful.
I guess I can offer living architecture is an analog of deeper connections that is steered by the systemic and relational conditions of life, and importantly, looking at how context reciprocally specifies form, function, program, histories, interactivity as an undulating network that operates across scales.
Very good. Wonderful. Philip, do you want to give it a try?
This is really hard.
I know it is. I know. You don't have.
First of all, I'll be a bad student and refuse to do it in one sentence. I'll do it in stuttering phrases, but I'll try to do a bundle. A simple and a complex answer. Simple is living architecture is architecture that can be understood to be alive. And understood is a tenuous thing because it is not something that's claimed or is defined by life, but rather seeks to be understood by being alive. And that's the complex answer in that is that we don't traditionally look at architecture as alive, at least some peoples and some colonies and some races and some cultures don't. Instead, we tend to think of architecture as everything that is not alive, the fundament, precisely the kind of stage where the living is done by something else. And that has produced terrible divisions and harm and polarization, even as it produces benefits, such as the Industrial Revolution, in which we try to exploit things by making them stable and definitely not alive, so that we can convert them into our own lives. We've had too many walls. We've had far too much polarization. Living things do need division. Living things do need some things to be sorted. And yet the terror and the instability and the kind of unspeakable qualities of what is happening in the world today are because of that imbalance. And so it's time to reconcile, which means that a kind of fragility and an openness seems to be crucial for us to move into a new kind of viability. So viability is the search of a living architecture.
Okay. I think you're right.
Yeah.
So there was a really nice question from Bianca Wico Martin. It's about feeling. So she says, along with aesthetic and utility, I think there's also a feeling that is associated with architecture or cities that seems living or rather alive. The feeling has to do with vigor, coexistence, diversity, and joy. And in similar way, um, Sasha has asked the question for all of you. Philip, at one point during the podcast, has touched on the notion of fragility in living architecture. So, to what degree would you say this is a characteristic or a principle that ties together the work of all of you? So, feeling fragility, I would say even sensuality, how how d- does your work address those things?
I think, I mean, the topic of fragility for me touches upon how living architecture ultimately is something that is in constant formation, right? That it has sort of metastable conditions where, you know, events are not necessarily discrete or singular, but have a reciprocity across a set of relationships. And in terms of feeling, the borderless and kind of informal nature of much of the work that I think all three of us are engaged in and produce has a resonance with people, and that resonance, I've actually had many people who have participated, engaged, visited my projects come to me later and say, you know, I wish that project was in my kid's school ground, or I wish that project was in our local park, or I wish that project was in a hospital, because they talked about how it gave them a sense of calm, a moment of pause in their day. And so I think there's something to the informal, boundless, kind of unraveling conditions, both in terms of materiality and also one's engagement with the projects, that allows for participation and a sense of agency. And then to be more specific, in a recent project, which I showed a couple of images of Ada for Microsoft Research, we were exploring architectures of sentiment and emotion, and specifically in the context of artificial intelligence, and together with my colleagues at Microsoft Research, sort of opening up the ethics around that, in terms of the issues of privacy and facial pattern recognition and collecting that data and so on, and instead to flip that and make it human-centered. And so in the context of Ada and feeling an emotive kind of architecture, the hope was to generate a space and a responsive set of material conditions that would expand the possible range of human engagement through even issues of beauty and kind of wonder and a sense of play and desire. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Sounds wonderful.
Okay, well, I'll try and add to that. So fragility and feeling, I think, are the two big kind of anchor points here. I mean, so far, I agree with everything that's being said, and I really do feel like I should bring objects into this, Philip. I think that's a great presentation tool. Pull up some artifacts, which I have some surrounding me, and maybe that would help explain it a bit. But you know, there is this thing for those who are more the old school architects, that we call techne and poesis, and how we sort of produce things in the studio culture. And techne is the things that you get. These are ancient Greek terms. Techne is the thing that you get from books, from textbook knowledge, from information that is distributed in a conventional form, and it's extraordinarily useful. Anything from learning a program to just understanding how structural components come together. But the poesis aspect of it, that's not in any textbook, or really almost anywhere. You'll find it in poetry, but these are the moments where you are showing, you're using your hands to craft things, and you explain to others or communicate together with others by just making. And that, I think that is a kind of a crucial way of understanding the kind of beginning the fragile space that we operate in, that the things that we make are always in some state of flux. I like to use the term painting a watercolor in a stream. Any idea that we have, there's something else that comes in and changes it, and something else has another feedback loop on top of it, and it's constantly being iterated upon. And when you're working with living systems that are precious, that have real requirements that took millions of years to evolve, the kind of the poesis of how we make things, and certainly the technique, completely turns the studio culture upside down. And I know Jenny has a studio laboratory, or at least I think a lot of us were doing that before that was really coined very well by Jenny's work, where there's this idea that you're trying to understand how these living things really function, whether it's cells or an actual organism, and then you're trying to introduce something from the atelier, from the thinking about how we've been working in design since the Beaux-Arts. Like, it's a very different sort of way. So those organisms are no longer things to be manipulated by people in our own idiom. They're actually things that become your partner in working on a project. You have to actually listen to them. They don't speak English or any language I know of, but they are sentient, and they do respond to different ways. And poesis, this kind of very fragile communication form, becomes really the only way to kind of create a discourse between that organism and an idea of an architecture, which is going to constantly shift. So, it's probably not, it's a great way of understanding process. And it is, for those out there that really want to know how to do this, I can't give you a dogmatic set of instructions, like you move from A to Z in this fashion. It's not like that at all. You're working with something that is made of the stuff of life, and has its own real constraints, and is operating in real time and needs to be fed, etc. And it's, you have to treat it with a deep level of equality. So when you want to talk about something that's fragile, this is fragile. So it's not bending, plywood, or working with steel, or even a lot of computing models, which computers just basically do what we tell them, sort of, or, try to. These are things that are not abstract. So because of that, the fragility is important, especially working with organisms that are endangered or close to it, threatened organisms. And then, so I'll pause there on the idea of process and fragility. And then the idea of emotion or feeling, we look for feeling in projects. The number one feeling we want is an orgasm. That would be terrific. If we can get to something that just explodes with, wow, that's amazing. Haven't seen that before. Totally turns us upside down. That works. And we try and fight feelings such as depression or loss or failure or fear. Fear being one of these big anchor emotions, the opposite of fear being love. So we work very hard to mitigate, if not to completely decimate, any notion of fear in our work. And that's not only in the organisms we're working with and the nature around us, but just from the perspective of our culture and our society. So I think that's my idea about fragility and feeling for the moment.
Wonderful.
Maybe I can chime in. I can't resist commenting more, because the two questions that launched both Jenny and Mitchell's responses are both, to me, spectacularly sensitive and rich questions. Bianca Martin's question about vigor and joy and feelings, and Sasha's complimentary question about fragility. And perhaps those two things are really fundamentally linked. Let me speculate that they're linked in two ways. On the surface, it seems like confidence, vigor, belief in life, joy, just ecstatic pleasure is so crucial to manifest. We need it. We need to build it. It is so fundamental to motivation. Doubt is something that anyone who works with complex work like architecture feels acutely. And so finding the kind of confidence to make a projection and to make proposals for change requires a kind of deep vigor. And yet, at the same time as the necessity and the confidence of that, I think we might agree that we've had in the last century an excess of intervention, of pushing, of making things happen, a kind of a callousness, which is the underbelly, the underside of that kind of happy joy, because it would say joy for whom? For only for some. And so perhaps as a correction for that, there's an acute need for just pure sensitivity, a deep kind of vulnerability where you let things in, where you take things inside your body, where you feel them, where you walk in other people's shoes, and where you simply give other people turns, and where you give other species their turn, and when you give other minerals their turn. So one response would be just as a kind of a feeling corrective, in which a whole terrain of openness and vulnerability and very deliberate fragility would be a profound contribution, with all of the terrain of insecurity and difficulty that might include. So the feelings might not be all positive, but they would be precious indeed, and somehow need deep support. But to my mind, if I become ambivalent like that, if I start washing back and forth between speaking of confidence on one hand and an openness which is a vulnerability on the other, then perhaps fragility becomes something much more important, not just the corrective to arrogance, not just a kind of a something which will rebalance harm that has been done by being unfeeling. Rather, it's very tempting to speak about life as being predicated not just on vigor, on driving, but actually the kind of oscillation back and forth, constantly tipping in order to grow, in order to bring in variation, in order to realize new things, that requires the most exquisitely fine-tuned kind of judgment. Not absolute laboratory control, but the kind of fine-tuned judgment where you find something, it might go one way, it might just go the other. The kind of fine-tuned judgment that we know that we have in our own psyches by just simply looking very closely at someone we love and lifting an eyebrow in a flicker and seeing them immediately laugh. We're hair, it seems like we're so fine-tuned to the most exquisite, tiny little flickers of disposition. And perhaps that's true of our sinuses too, and our other faculties as well. I mean, it would be very tempting to say that our sinuses and our smells can detect one single molecule, a kind of extraordinary mechanism for parsing and detecting metabolisms of an unutterably fine and precise nature. Even if we've abused and lost 95% of their faculties, they're still there. And so perhaps that would suggest that actually fragility is precisely the kind of calibration mechanism that allows us to navigate life itself in an architecture. Now that has rather profound implications, I think, for tectonics. because making strong walls and creating pressure differentials that absolute divide the storms from the peaceful thing inside produces one kind of architecture, which we know very well. The need for stability. It's no small thing. It's not a solved question at all. And yet somehow it might be thought of, I believe, as antithetical to life. Could we produce a tectonic, kind of a system that has the kind of butterfly wings tremor that famous physicist Ilya Prigogine spoke to us about 60 years ago, that would be fragile in the most positive sense of the word, as being a kind of a calibration mechanism for creating living systems?
That's a question. That's what we're all working on, isn't it? Thank you for that. So I'm reminded of ethos and thanatos, love and death. And Robert Bolton asked us a question in that direction. He says that it's a provocation, so be ready. He says the primary goal of living architecture should be decay. Decomposition seems like to be understated, under an emphasized aspect of living in living architecture, at least in this conversation. And the design of endings still seems generally neglected by those disciplines who build the built environment. So he's interested in decay. Basically, I think he's interested in when do we close the circle, right? How are what we're making closing the loop, right? Using decay, using death as part of the living, maybe.
Well, I mean, decay is one state. I guess you were alluding to something that would be circuitous. That from that decay, we have another, we have a remnant system. From that remnant system, we get, the seeds of the next, and then succession takes place, and we have a whole new functioning moment or ecosystem. I think so. Decay is an insertion in one frame of time in a succession of many other moments within a living architecture or within any system of life. So I think we can expect it to be there. It usually comes right after a disturbance. So some kind of a disturbance will start the decay, usually an earthquake, a fire, a lightning bolt, a storm, a mudslide, or some kind of other natural sort of element that begins it, or just the slow process of cells sloughing off and degenerating and not working as well as they used to, and starting to the system slowly winding down, which is also an expectation. But either way, it produces the same results. That entropy, it's built into the physics of our problem. So I guess we can't necessarily change it. And the idea is to embrace it. So I would agree that decay is absolutely a crucial moment, but it's just one moment.
Yeah, in the cycle.
Yeah, I agree completely with your comments, Mitch. And I guess the way I will approach the provocation, which I appreciate, and the question is through my specific multi-year ongoing collaboration with a cell molecular biologist, Dr. Peter Lloyd-Jones, who, and Philip, I'm so glad you started with those objects, the sort of power of the sphere, because for me, there were sort of 2 points early on in my research working across disciplines. I think it was around 2006 or so that I really began to understand the promise of what a living architecture could be, or what we might also call adaptive architecture. And in one case, it was watching under a microscope in Peter's lab the role of context, the extracellular matrix, upon cellular behavior in terms of motility and surface design and so on. And so we were literally observing this cell absent of its extracellular matrix, and it was a perfect sphere, perfect equilibrium. And then as soon as that droplet of ECM was placed into the Petri dish, all of a sudden that perfect sphere went like this, right? It immediately started to communicate and interact with this protein-rich, networked environment. And so I agree, decay is one moment within that event space, right? And specifically in that work on Peterson, we were looking at, you know, serious diseases such as breast cancer and pulmonary hypertension, and the role that the architecture of the ECM has upon disease. And in his work and his colleagues, you know, they were focusing on how you adjust the architecture of the environment. You don't attack the cell, you adjust the architecture of the environment to you know, hopefully provide cures and you know, to make sense of these disease scenarios. So it's that dynamic reciprocity that is, you know, so powerful in the relationships between environment and cell and form. And the other example that I'll give, which was seminal for me, was a workshop that Dr. Robert Greist, who's a really incredible and prolific mathematician, a topologist, he was explaining topology to a group of students and myself and another colleague. And he brought all of these amazing models, and he had us all blindfolded, and he said, you know, hold these models. And we started to shift the models around, and all of a sudden there was this moment that just, you felt this transition. And he said, you just moved from one-dimensional space to two-dimensional space, right? And the understanding was the fact that we were feeling it through our bodies as a part of that connection. But all of that to say that I completely agree. Decay is one part of that scenario of events.
Great. Thank you, Jenny.
Maybe just to offer a bit more on decay and
Sure.
to connect it to two beautiful questions in the chat that I think might harmonize. That is Alex Webb's meditation on a kind of a layering coming from the wasp's nest that might speak of something beyond just binary conditions of inside or outside, speaking about agency, and Brian Lilly's parallel beautiful question about kind of the anchoring of things where flux may very well occur, and decay and release. The lack of stasis might be the truth, and yet there's a springboard very often that can be so very helpful, which is a static point or you know, a deeply dense rock, perhaps, in the analogy of Brian's comments. To my mind, those examples just really underline a kind of quandary, because if decay is held to threaten life, then we need to fight it. Then we need to close up, and we need to hold fast. On the other hand, we know that vitrified, closed things can be articles of death as well, not simply the fundament on which we can live. I mean, if it was really Mies van der Rohe's Toronto Dominion Center or Seagram Center, then it might be a happy place, because those kind of stripped stages for action do allow freedom on top of them, but they really presume a very robust, free public life on top. They take that for granted. And when that life is much more fragile, then those same stages become very sterile deserts indeed, which is the kind of condition I think that befalls us now. So how can those things resolve themselves? Is it truly possible to say both? To me, that requires a kind of a vision where each of those polarized states can be understood to be fertile and pathological by turn simultaneously, depending on the balance. I mean, for example, the radical state of freedom inside a sanctuary can just as readily become anoxic and subject to eutrophy, the kind of static, very disappointing, kind of almost dangerous stage that perhaps Jackson Pollock reached when he was dripping too much in his paintings and just couldn't go any further than this kind of radically saturated state in the field of the canvas. If that's true, that each one of these polarized qualities is both an extraordinary affordance and also a great danger, then how might it be possible to deliberately be precarious between them so that each can tip into the next? That takes a kind of a language, and I think also a tectonic invention and a sense of a metabolism which is much more complex than the kind of binary state. The state of buffer instead, in which one thing contains the other, a kind of deliberate imbalance. In fact, a kind of a festival of precarity itself, of celebrating the sense that we can make ourselves dizzy and that that's an incredibly enjoyable sense, is perhaps something that fundamentally can resolve those things. And maybe those things are not unfamiliar at all. It doesn't have to be a mystery, like a weird quandary. Actually, it can be absolutely ordinary if we look at states at play, because they seem to precisely have this kind of dynamics in which both the rock and let's say flying away from that kind of fundament is fundamental. I fear that my response has turned to abstraction, but I hope that it points to the question of what we contribute by deliberately combining them into a state of ambivalence as a very positive quality. Precarity may be a key.
Thank you so much, Philip. I think it's a wonderful place to end. I feel very uplifted. I was worried that we'll end up in the decay, but now I feel uplifted again. So it's great. So thank you everybody for coming to the seminar and putting your questions in the chat and everything. And you will be all getting a letter that will direct you to where you can have the recording of the podcast. And then we'll also ask you some questions, such as if you want to propose another podcast down the road. So far, we're planning for 4, but we're very open to have suggestions of anyone who would like to have some topic of discussion. So we would love to hear from you. And in closing, I want to have a big thanks for Rob Gorbet, who's been helping us all the way along and being in the background. And anyway, thanks a lot, Rob. And Edgar for planning the podcast and the questions and everything. And then Sasha for doing a wonderful job in the editing, which was a big job actually. So, and I think the result is excellent. And of course, our panelists, Jenny, Mitchell, and Philip. So thank you, everyone. And great to see you in this new way we're relating. And for people living in Halifax, I hope we can get together for coffee. All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, friends.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.